Hello, I'm Tom Ferguson and welcome to The Fundamental Molecule. This show explores the intersection of water, technology, and entrepreneurship. Each week, I interview innovators, experts, entrepreneurs, and investors in the world of water, helping us understand where this trillion-dollar industry is headed. These are the stories of the people building the future of the world's most valuable and fundamental resource.
Disclaimer. Tom Ferguson is the managing partner of Virgin Island Ventures. All opinions expressed by Tom and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Virgin Island Ventures. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be viewed as investment advice or relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
It's well documented that we at Burnt Island Ventures love founder market fit, but we really love it when it leads us to a founder and company that represent that fundamental leap forward in the operation of that market. Josh Mackanic is one of those founders. His 2 decades of experience in infrastructure has led him to build a platform people have talked about in the industry for a long time, but he and his team have been the ones to bring it to life. His deep knowledge of the infrastructure world is obvious in our conversation. We cover everything from the identification of the problem to how he thought through his fundraising process to how he sees the role of CivilGrid in unlocking a huge amount of friction in the wholesale infrastructure upgrade that the US requires in the coming decades. Please enjoy my conversation with the excellent Josh Mackanic. Josh, how excellent to see you. Thank you very much for joining us on The Fundamental Molecule.
Lovely to see you as well, Tom. Good to see you, Norza.
Always, always, always. So, Josh, we've liked you since day one because you have the advantage of uncommon insight. You are one of the founders on the Burnt Island that has really radical founder market fit. Could you just walk us through exactly what you were doing prior to this? And what was the nature of the insight that you saw? What was your SH1T moment where you were like, this is crazy and needs to change?
So for the 15 years prior to CivilGrid, 2/3 of that was spent working for utility, Pacific Gas and Electric out in California, primarily managing large construction programs. So I've built about $500 million worth of infrastructure. So I lived on the inside of a utility and got to learn the inner workings and the complexities of both how utilities operate and how things get built in this country. After PG&E, I spent a few years, and really it was while I was preparing to start CivilGrid, in the commercial real estate industry, which is also informative just because that's another sector that we service. I think those experiences alone weren't the reason for starting CivilGrid. I mean, I think, and really for anybody, I think who's looking to start a business, I think you have to have this, this itch, this like crazy bit of crazy inside of you that like
you can't cope, right? You're like
this restlessness.
Yeah, I've got to go. I have to go do this.
Yeah, and part of the reasons for me starting CivilGrid were somewhat internal to me, and like what's gonna make me feel satisfied, as I live my life. And so I left PG&E because that part of me that was restless, that part of me that wanted to have impact, that wanted to have more agency was, I think was slowly dying. That's what happens to entrepreneurship and large organizations.
Yeah.
But, then when it came time to, okay, let me go build something, obviously smart money was to go solve a problem I knew better, I hope, than anybody else, which was a problem that was very core to the construction industry, which I spent a lot of time in, and core to utilities that I operated in for a long time.
So exactly what did that sort of look like? And I think one of the things I've always enjoyed most is the kind of the ruthlessly practical explanation. There's a slide in your deck of your previous financing round, which is a picture of, I can't remember what the asset was. It's kind of like a substation box. I don't speak energy, so I don't really know what's going on, but whatever that was.
A traffic cabinet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the cabinet.
This was the beginning of my pathway into water, actually. So I worked for PG&E, a gas electric utility, and turns out one of the things you learn really quick when you work for utility is you're not alone. You're operating in an environment with other operators and other assets. And so I was doing a project in San Mateo, and a lot of reasons, I ended up putting a traffic cabinet on top of a water main, which is not where you want to put a traffic cabinet. I now know for a lot of reasons.
Sounds really painful. Yeah.
It's not like I set this thing on top of an exposed water, like the water main was buried. We didn't know it was there until it's too late.
Or like a fire hydrant. You built it around a fire hydrant.
Exactly. Good luck, firemen. Yeah, send them on an Easter egg hunt.
Yeah.
The reality is, as utility operators, we're sharing a lot of the same real estate. And the job of operating those assets is actually really complex. I mean, you have to know exactly where your assets are, you have to know the state of them, and you have to be able to access them when things go wrong. And so when I put a cabinet on top of a water main, that impacted their ability to go kind of operate, maintain that asset. The issue there is me doing that cost me $40,000, not chump change. And the observation was, if I had known everything about this work area, this site at the inception of design, would have come up with a different design. But because we didn't have that knowledge, we kind of rolled into the field, not half cocked, but like underinformed, and made a design decision that wasn't the best. And changing anything on the fly in the field is always way more expensive than planning for it upfront.
Absolutely. So walk us through that a little bit, actually being on a construction site. And maybe you can tell us what kind of, like, in the most extreme example, what a dig-in is. And what's the result? Because it's such an interesting practical problem. Like, these projects are very tightly designed in terms of time. What happens when you get into trouble when you're out there kind of in the world?
I wish that like we were all building in the wild, wild west. Nothing's out there. We could just kind of blow and go. No big deal. That's not the case, and that's decreasingly the case. Like, we're operating in increasingly dense environments. There's more and more infrastructure. There's more and more infill work that we're doing, brownfield work. And so when you're planning a project, when you're executing a project, you're navigating all that, right? You're navigating existing infrastructure, existing rights, past uses, jurisdictional constraints. And it's hard enough when you're running a construction project to manage the stuff that's in your control. When do the materials come on site? What do we build first, second, third? What people go where? But if you, on top of that, you have to manage things that are outside of your control or adapt to that, the complexity increases tenfold. Maybe an analogy is helpful. Running a complex construction project is like orchestrating a symphony. You're conducting Beethoven's Fifth, except that you're halfway through the second movement and somebody walks in and says, "Hey, strings, I need you to move over 4 feet, but don't miss a beat, because if you do, somebody probably gets hurt or maybe dies. Just do it, and do it carefully.
Just be really, really good all the time.
And do it now, because it needs to happen now.
Immediately.
And then as halfway through, it starts raining. And so I think that's if you haven't been on a construction site before, that's why it's so hard. There's a complexity to the process, getting the right talent on site at the right time, having materials come in, figuring out how best to sequence the work. But then in addition to that complexity, you're having to adapt to the unknown. The soil contamination you didn't expect, the car accident that happens 2 blocks down, and all of a sudden you have to find a way to reroute this like large truck that like can only come in on a specific path. So from the outside, it's like, why is this project delayed? I think when you don't appreciate all the different moving parts, it's easy to get frustrated. But that's why the jobs of construction managers and project managers are so hard, is because they're conducting this complex symphony in a moving, unstructured environment. And that's why planning is so critical, because the better your plan, both in terms of identifying potential unknowns and thinking ahead of time through that orchestration, the more likely you are to be successful. So studies have shown that 92% of projects go over schedule or budget. Surprise. Your biggest ability to impact that, to affect the outcome of the job, is actually at the design and planning stage.
So that's where you wanted to put your intervention. So what was it like when you said, okay, at the inception of this, like, what is it that we are trying to solve? What are we going to make considerably better in your own and your colleagues' lives?
One of the roles I held at PG&E before I left is I had oversight for PG&E's gas assets, kind of the data about the infrastructure that we operated. And both in that role and the role I had running projects, it was apparent to me that there was just a wealth of data that we had available that was obviously very helpful to us in operating of our business, but also would be really helpful to the next person coming along in the same street as we were in. If only we could find a way to break down the silos a little bit and help each other as utility operators a little bit more, we could work more effectively. If I had more data about the site I'm designing in, the site I'm going to build in from day one of design, again, I can come up with a smarter design faster. And so I think the observation of kind of the siloing and kind of the understanding of the power of that data in the hands of the right people on the project, I realized I think there's an opportunity to kind of try to bridge those gaps in a way that helps us build the way we need to build. I mean, you could say why? Like, why does it matter that construction projects go over scheduled budget? I mean, yes, it's always annoying to the neighbors when your project runs over. But I think the bigger issue is there's a huge amount we have to build as a country. If we're going to keep our standard of living, our way of life, if we're going to address climate change, adapt to a new world, if we're going to house the unhoused, I think we're short like 300,000 roofs in this country. We got to build more, but the pool of money is only so big. And so we got to find a way to do more with less. And so making construction as an industry more efficient is going to enable us to really address the big challenges that we have as a society going forward.
No question. It's completely fundamental. And obviously my questions were going to be about your reflections on the IRA opportunity, but I want to park that for just a second because I want to stay with what you guys do at CivilGrid. So walk us through the mind of your user. So now what does that look like? What does that world look like after CivilGrid versus what did it look like before what you've built?
Before CivilGrid, when you go to start a project, there's just all this upfront research that you're doing to understand as is conditions. What utilities am I designing around? What are the jurisdictional constraints I'm operating within? What are the soils I'm working with that impact either construction means and methods, maybe material decisions, other design decisions, impact constructability? And so as a project manager and a designer, you gather actually a bit of a team to go try and build as much of an understanding as possible as those conditions in order to start design. And so on a really practical granular level, what does that look like? That means I got to figure out what utilities operate on this street. And then I got to find a point of contact for all of them and send them all an email saying, hey, I've got a project coming up. Do you have a map of like what's in this street that you have that I might need to like not hit? So you send out all these emails and then half of them going to respond to because like
people are busy.
You got the wrong email address.
Getting other emails from other people trying to do buildings. Yeah.
And so you follow up. Anyway, eventually 4 or 6 weeks later, you have like 8 PDFs now in your hands and you're kind of trying to like overlay them all and figure out like what hornet's nest I'm about to walk into. And then you got to kind of translate all that into CAD because that's kind of the recipe book for the guys in the field. And so one, that's just a lot of time, a lot of man hours. 2, it's prone to mistake. You're likely to potentially miss things. And oh, by the way, when things are like hard and complex, like humans are deeply lazy creatures, like you're liable to kind of like cut corners and skip steps. Inevitably what happens is 1, you spend more money than you probably need to kind of get ready to start design. And then 2, you go and design a little bit half-cocked. You don't really know exactly what you're up against. And so with CivilGrid, what we're doing is preemptively consolidating an unprecedented amount of site-specific data. Again, information about, yes, what utilities are where, but also geotech conditions, land rights, and much more. And packaging in a tool where project teams, engineers, project managers, developers, pre-construction teams can access it real time and collaboratively plan out scope the job, plan out design, put together bid packages, extract data to inform the engineering process, so on and so forth.
So how did you think about the acquisition of a critical mass of data? Like, where did you see the threshold of the tool really becoming kind of useful? To ask it in a different way, as you were going in, you've got a kind of a really interesting start problem because the threshold of what you need to have for somebody to be able to be like site specific, there are various things that you had to do. You had to be geographically constrained. You had to be able to go and get a critical mass of data. And what I was always really impressed by was the speed in which you were able to amalgamate it. You don't need to go into how you actually kind of did it. I just want you to reflect on the point at which you crossed that point where your customers were like, oh, okay, this is the subsurface source of truth. This is what's really useful for me. Just reflecting on the process of getting.
I think that the geographic coverage was definitely an issue. So we're like, let's do this in San Jose. And obviously the smaller you draw the box, the easier it is to kind of like pull this together. And we started going to some companies and like, oh, this is really cool. But very few firms just do work in San Jose. If you're a civil engineering firm, you're going to do work in San Jose, but you also do work in San Mateo and Oakland. And for those who aren't, those are just other cities in the Bay Area.
Cities in the Bay, yeah.
And so you realize really quick, if I'm an engineering firm and I'm doing 100 projects a year and your tool can help me with like 15 of them, I don't really want to upend how I work for like 15% of my work. Like it just doesn't make sense. So
absolutely.
I think we learned really quickly we had to get a critical mass of coverage geographically in order for this to really work. We realized, okay, we got to blow this out to, turns out state boundaries are just really helpful. Like companies tend to organize around that on some level. There's a lot of engineering firms that operate either just within a state or that have their teams organized by state. And so we said, okay, we think that a state is a bite-sized chunk that we can start with. But then there's this question of like, well, how much different type of data, how complete does the data need to be in order for folks to to say, like, I'm willing to work with you. Internally at CivilGrid, I think we have a much clearer picture today, obviously, than we did when we started, about like what that threshold is. And you don't have to be at 100%, but, and I'm not going to get into kind of the specifics of like what I think threshold materiality is, but definitely has to be over 50%.
Yeah.
In terms of completeness, accuracy of one of your types of data sets. And you probably need to have 2, 3 for the product to be compelling.
Yeah, your data set, it constantly amazes me the degree to which you've been able to get like well beyond that threshold in a remarkable kind of period of time. You're just getting to the point where you are, we're just talking about this before we hit record, that you've been adding, what was it, a customer a week for
about 6 months?
For about 6 months, which especially, people who know this market, that's a good clip. And it's also like a really interesting sales motion through which you've been able to kind of achieve that. I just want you to reflect for a second on the role of the networking mode of customers, the social proof within customers. Like, what is it that's underlying that pace? Because it's pretty good, especially when you think about the downstream economics of establishing these relationships, repeat usage, expanding usage, people working with you more over time, more in depth over time. There's an awful lot that you can serve them with, and getting that quantity of people in the door is excellent.
Yeah. So, look, there was a lot of trial and error getting that point, as you well know.
There always is, by the way. It's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I was at an event a couple of days ago, and we were actually talking about go-to-market and kind of reflections. And I think one of the comments I made is it's really important as a founder for you to be radically honest with yourself about what you know and or are good at, and then what you don't know and aren't good at. And I had to learn the hard way that I knew nothing about sales go-to-market. Like, I worked for a utility. If there's one thing a utility never has to do, it's sell.
Exactly. Like it or lump it, as they say back in the whole country. It's like, yeah, this is what we're doing. And
yeah. You just sign up here. You want light? Okay. And then
there's an interesting asterisk to that. We don't need to go into it, but every time that you go to a rate case, I know the DEP just got an 8.5% like rate case through. That's an element of sales, but in general, the point is well taken. Like, for sure, this is not part of the core utility skill set.
And so I think that the biggest mistakes I've made along the way are selling. And I think I was fortunate enough to get connected with people who had a lot of great sales experience. So one of our early investors had this group they made available to us called Closed Loop. It was these awesome sales veterans who had written all these books and put together this training material. And they were super helpful in getting me up the learning curve quickly around what is this as a discipline, as a practice. And no, it's not just about smiling and being a pretty face. Like, it's a process. It's, if you do certain things in a disciplined manner, like, it yields results. Now then you have to take those methodologies, those models, and apply them to your market and figure out, like, because every market, every customer segment is going to have its particularities. So then figuring out what works for your customer segment, it's a question of messaging. It's a question of like figuring out the who do we need to get in front of and how. It's also a question of pricing. So getting, yes, the product to a critical mass of capabilities and features, but also the messaging right. We sell primarily to engineers. Engineers are very skeptical creatures. It's their job. You don't want the bridge to collapse. You want them to be cautious people.
There's a lot at stake, and everybody always throws shade at them, but there's a reason why they're the way that they are.
And so there's obviously inherent in that. That means that there's a trust building process. So showing up in the right forums, and then I think social proof has been really big, right? So us being able to say, we've got very reputable companies, the WSPs of the world, the Kimley Horns, the Woodard & Currens, that have chosen to use CivilGrid on their projects because it makes them smarter, faster. It helps them win more bids, helps them execute design more effectively. That carries a lot of weight in these conversations. And so I think us getting the motion right was the beginning of acceleration, and then having a bit more kind of buzz in the water, more social proof, kind of only helped accelerate that as we moved out of last year into this year.
Start moving the flywheel forward. The team at BIV all hide under the table when I start talking about flywheels. Well, they don't. Everyone's as into them as I am, but I'm particularly into them. So an integral part of that is your product. And from the very first moment we saw you, it is clear that you guys really, really understood design, and you understood product, and you understood interface, and you understood the importance of haptics, and you understood how to translate what you knew about your customer into the very specific workflows within the software. Just talking to me about, like, how you've thought about that over time, how you think you've got better, why you think you've got better, because, especially given that you started at a pretty kind of elevated position in terms of what you were doing, you were already good and you've become even better. How does that come about?
I think that on some level, I knew a lot about the problems we were solving. I didn't know anything about building software. When I was doing some consulting work, getting ready to start CivilGrid, I actually took some Python classes on Coursera. I got through about 3 modules and I was like, yeah, no, I'm not writing the code for this.
Yeah.
we need to go hire somebody.
Again, it's a side, like there's a great podcast called Invest Like the Best with Patrick O'Shaughnessy, and he described like just starting the editing process like by himself. And he was like, first episode was like, there's absolutely no effing way. There's no way.
Yeah.
Anyway, carry on. Yeah.
But it's always something that I've thought of, like products are something that I've thought a lot about. And like I was always a cliche, but always a huge Steve Jobs fan, and I used to watch all of his product introductions, when he'd do his keynotes, releasing new stuff, and the love and passion that he had for what was being made and doing so with excellence resonated with me always. I remember, I think I was reading his biography and talked about how I think he yelled at the team because the way the components were laid out on
the circuit board,
one of the motherboards, was like inconsistent and not aesthetic. And he was like, ugly, horrific, you have to do it again. And they're like, you're crazy. Nobody's going to see this. And he's like, I don't care. Everything we do needs to be done well. Look, that's maybe a little bit extreme. I think I've always loved beautiful products and been drawn to them. And I think to be drawn to beauty is a very human thing. And so if I want people to be drawn to using my application, I need to make something that's beautiful. I think that was always something that I wanted to see happen. And look, I think there's still a long ways I want us to go with CivilGrid, but I think we're starting off on the right foot there. I'm also a very lazy human, and I believe that laziness is like a fundamental human trait characteristic. And so if you don't make things simple, people also aren't going to go out of their way to use what you're building. And so I think in my mind, making our product beautiful and making it simple, taking complicated things and simplifying them, we're going to be an important part of people wanting to use CivilGrid and wanting to tell their friends to use CivilGrid. So I think those are some of the things that have informed how we've gone about building the CivilGrid product, and obviously been that powered by all the knowledge of what I wish I had when I was running jobs.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. Yeah. I sometimes reflect on the degree to which I do not hold humans in a high esteem. Why? But like, what I mean like that, when you reflect on what you said about people being lazy, the way I prefer to say it is that like there was such an enormous degree of inertia in human nature, right? Our ability or desire to do anything differently ever is so low that you have to make it both incredibly easy and incredibly attractive to move away from the status quo, almost regardless of how bad the status quo is. I mean, you were just talking about having beautiful product design. I mean, I can only imagine. I did a little bit of work during consultancy with, some of the software suites that utilities and others were being sort of forced to interact with on a daily basis. And design was not top of the considerations of, this is, to call it clunky is an insult to clunkiness.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just really respect the way in which you've done it. So the other thing you said that you came from, personally, I think, interacting with you when you were like fundraising, there was clearly a kind of a natural sales knack there, because when you're in the fundraising process, you're just happy to be selling something different, but you are still selling something. And then when you went about your last fundraise, I really thought it was best in class about the process through which you went through to be able to do it. So cohorting your investors, but also, in terms of the layers, it was as thorough as we had seen. How did you think about your last fundraise? And what are the lessons that you would want to take away going forward? What do you wish you'd known ahead of time? Like, how do you reflect on that side of?
So I think, we all hear the headlines, right? ABC company raises $50 million round. And, the reality is, with very few exceptions, money doesn't fall into the laps of startup founders. You have to go out and get it. And like anything, things done haphazardly typically don't go well. Things done in a planned, thoughtful way typically go better, right? And best laid plans. So I think, and the more specific you are in how you lay your plans, the more likely you are to be successful. As I think about fundraising, yes, it's about getting money, but it's also about building the team, the CivilGrid team. And so, I think that the first lens, from my perspective, is like, who do we want on this team? Like, there's an opportunity to get another group of, in theory, like really experienced, intelligent folks aligned behind the mission of CivilGrid and helping us roll this boulder in the right direction. And so just surveying the landscape, figuring out who all is out there and who at a firm level and who at an individual level is likely to be interested in what we're doing. And not only interested, but potentially helpful.
Yes.
And then from there, there's, okay, how do we get in front of these people? And coming in cold to an investor is always going to, first impressions are important, right? I think hopefully we've all learned that. We learned that by the time we got out of middle school. And so the more you can control those first impressions and make them positive, the better things are likely to go. So coming in as a random email to an investor, you don't get to control the first impressions as effectively than if somebody they know and trust says, hey, there's this really interesting company that I think you should take a look at. And so for us, it was identify who we want to go after. Let's find who can get us in front of them. And then let's do that in a concerted way so that we don't burn ourselves out and we kind of get as many looks as possible at the same time. Because as a founder, the deck's stacked against you. You're only going to fundraise so many times, and they're doing this all day, every day. So they have N of 5,000, you have N of 1 going into these conversations, these negotiations. And so the only way to have power in the process is to create scarcity, to try and make yourself into the belle of the ball, make it so that you've got multiple people who want to go take you out for a dance, and then you get to decide who. And so then you kind of want to at once kind of go out into the market, but in a semi-structured way. You're going to have to refine your pitch the first 20 times you do it. So like start with folks that you like, but like aren't your top choice, and then like work your way towards the folks that you really want to have as your investors.
Yeah. The phrase we use is like, never go down a rabbit hole live. You always have to have stress tested this with people who sort of at least know what they're kind of like talking about, or at least can see where there would be a thread of an argument. It's very, very important that you can pretend that this is the first time. Hey, that's a great question. I suppose I'd never really thought about this before, but hey, here's how I think about it. And of course, you thought about it 2 weeks ago and you're absolutely perfectly prepared. Yeah. It's completely fine. But there's a huge amount of that work that's done. And I think structurally, it was really impressive. And obviously the outcome was reflective of the degree of work that you did. The other thing on fundraising is that you're absolutely right. This is like, we would prefer if people celebrated fundraising less. And I think you were one of the crews that actually did that. Like, look, this is the resources we need to build the product that we need to be able to solve the really vital problem in the context of like building new infrastructure in this country and then eventually in the world. Coming back, because we mentioned it earlier in terms of obviously the obvious context is with the IRA, but you've now been an infrastructure guy for, getting on for 2 decades.
Yep.
How do you now reflect upon the sort of generalized opportunity within infrastructure, the challenges we have, the degree to which like the IRA is going to be helpful for that? Are you hopeful about the infrastructural future? There aren't many people with your viewpoint.
It's a hard road ahead. Again, when I got my first job at PG&E, I was like, this ain't going to last. Cause like my sense from the outside is like, don't utilities just do like the same thing over and over and over again for like forever? Like how exciting can this be? I thought I was going to die of boredom, within the first year, but then I was there for 10 years. I think this because I realized once you get on the inside, how actually really complex and hard it is to make sure that when you wake up in the morning and you flip the light switch, the light comes on, or when you kind of turn the shower knob, you get both water coming out and that water's hot. And to do that without blowing anybody up.
Yeah.
So, we used to say at PG&E, like we transport a highly flammable explosive material to the doorstep of 20 million people every day. Not obvious. So if you look at how we built our infrastructure, there was a big boom post-war. A lot of stuff was installed in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Some stuff was built with steel. And if you maintain steel correctly, in theory, it can last forever. There's a lot of ifs there, right? There's a lot of things you got to do right. Some stuff was built with different materials. And some of those materials have a useful life of 50, 60, 70 years. Well, do the math. We're at 50, 60, 70 years.
Hands up.
There's a lot of stuff that's going to start breaking at increasing rates. Oh, by the way, layer on top of that energy transition. So we're going to radically change. There's just so many different components in energy transition, upstream, midstream, downstream. Like how do we generate the energy? How do we move the energy? And how to provision it to the folks who, now it's not just homes, it's cars.
And then what does it get used by? It's fundamentally changing.
To do all those things, you got to build stuff. Like it's construction. I think that the IRA is a critical catalyst to us, one, making sure that the bridges we drive across 10 years from now are still standing, that we're still able to move gas and water and sewage effectively through our increasingly dense urban areas, as well as enable this energy transition towards a cleaner future. Like we're talking to engineering firms all the time, construction firms all the time. And COVID was a bit of a recession. Look at the past 5 years I've been talking to folks, there was zero slowdown in work with our clients. The engineering firms are struggling to find enough people to do all the work that's out there. So I think bringing some more funding into the ecosystem, I think was critical to get more work done that we need to support society. But then we also got to find a way to do that work more efficiently, because it's not clear we're going to have all the bodies we need to get all this stuff done.
No, exactly. It's a fundamental and underappreciated choke point that very, very few people understand, but you do. We've come to our closing question. Josh, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Our closing question to everybody is, what is the single most important piece of advice for future and aspiring water entrepreneurs?
I'm not going to answer your question because I'll give you two.
Tricky.
So everybody says it. It takes grit to start a company. I heard it a million times when I was thinking about starting CivilGrid, and I was like, I've got it.
I've got grit.
Great.
Loads of it.
I dramatically underestimated what folks actually meant when they said that. The loneliness of the early days, just the conviction that you have to latch onto. There's a problem that needs to be solved, and you can actually do it and do it successfully. When you're all alone on an island, it was way more significant than I thought it was going to be. And so I think the piece of advice there is prepare yourself mentally, physically. If you want to do this, going into it, prepare yourself for the road to probably be longer than you expect it to be. And for you to need to have a level of resolve that is probably 2, 3, 4x what you think it needs to be today. So that'd be my first piece of advice is, gird yourself emotionally and physically. The second is, when you're building a company, you're not building a product. You're building a machine that's going to deliver value for customers. If you just think about building a product, you're very likely going to build something that nobody cares about, or you're going to build it wrong. If you don't have customers, you don't have a business. So you really need to start with the customers and work backwards. And so spending as much time as possible, as early as possible. And again, this is cliche too, but spending as much time as possible with the customers that you're trying to serve to really understand them, both their needs and their pain points, but also like how their businesses operate, because you're going to have to sell into those businesses, and really understanding them, you're going to level is going to be important to bringing value to them. And like, what are their incentives? What are their psychoses? And then working backwards from that to like, what product do I need to build to serve this market?
No, absolutely. What way we try to articulate this is that like everybody falls in love with products, but products aren't the point. Products are just a medium for the delivery of a value proposition. Value proposition is what counts. And you can only understand the value proposition in the context of really understanding your customer. But yeah, the idea of product focused, it's not in out of sequence. It's super not helpful. Those are two excellent ones. Even though you cheated, Josh. It's such a pleasure as always. Congratulations on what you're building. It's so profoundly central to our ability to do what we need to do to change the paradigm of how we build things in order to change the way in which we fundamentally live in the world. It really is an extraordinary project that you're undertaking, and my congratulations to you and the team. Thank you very much for being on The Fundamental Molecule.
Tom, Marissa, thank you so much. Pleasure.
Cheers, sir.